Welcome back to the OpenAI Associate Developer course. In this lesson, we'll explore the OpenAI Translation API. This powerful tool enables you to translate your audio and get back English translated text. This multilingual functionality can provide a valuable feature for multilingual applications and services. As we have already gone into significant detail for the Transcription API, you are already familiar with the majority of the features, configurations, and outputs provided by the Translation API. The only real difference between these two endpoints is that the Translation API provides output text in a different language than the input audio. The reason all the parameters are going to be familiar is because both the Transcription and Translation APIs are built on the same underlying model, the Whisper 1 model. Recall that the configuration properties we set are to guide the model's behavior, and if the model is the same, the configuration properties will also be the same. It is for this reason that the configuration properties for the Transcription and Translation API are nearly identical. With that said, let's briefly go over how the configuration properties are used in the Translation API. 1. File. This property is exactly that, a valid audio file, just as in the Transcription API. However, this audio can be in any of the OpenAI supported languages. This is the audio you want translated and then transcribed into text format. 2. Model. As with the Transcription API, this specifies which OpenAI model to use for the translation, and the only model currently supported is the Whisper 1 model. 3. The prompt allows you to provide additional context or instructions for the translation, guiding the AI to produce more accurate results. Here, the prompt can play a more significant role in the Translation API than in the Transcription API. This is because of cultural acronyms, colloquial nuances, local meanings and interpretations, which should be outlined in the prompt to guide the model to provide more accurate translations for your purposes. 4. Response format. This is identical in use to that in the Transcription API and defines the format in which the translated text is returned. 5. Temperature. This too is identical in use to that in the Transcription API and controls the randomness of the translation. There are a couple of important omissions to note in the Translation API configuration properties versus the Transcription API. These are language and timestamp granularities. Let's understand these differences. The OpenAI Translation API automatically detects the language of the input audio file, so a separate language configuration property is not required. Although you can provide a language property, it's not recommended by OpenAI. If you choose to include it, ensure it is in ISO 639-1 format, is one of the supported languages, and matches the language of the input audio file. However, for best results, it's advisable to rely on the API's automatic language detection. Next is the timestamp granularities property. While the timestamp granularities property is not used by the Translation API, the response format property is still relevant. Setting it to verbose JSON will only ever yield a segments array, just as the Transcription API. However, while you can add in the timestamp granularities property to your configuration object, it is ignored. The biggest impact this has is that you cannot see timestamp granularities at the word level in a translation, no matter what you set the timestamp granularities property to. Therefore, note both the timestamp granularities and language properties are ignored in the Translation API. Another subtle difference: the output object returned by the Translation API call is a translation rather than a transcription object type. In summary, the key configuration and return properties for the OpenAI Transcription and Translation APIs are virtually identical. Now that we understand the similarities and subtle differences between the two APIs, let's dive into coding a Translation API call. As we have done previously, let's set up our main.ts file with the basic OpenAI setup code and the async main function. Here is the basic main.ts skeleton setup code we're used to seeing. Now, let's add the OpenAI Translation API call. This call is OpenAI Audio Translations Create, and we pass in our OpenAI configurations object. Here, you'll notice the return object is an OpenAI Audio Translations translation type object. While this is a different type than the Transcription API, the text property is still available, and we'll start by simply printing out the translated plain text. Now let's move to our defs file and set up our configuration object before initially running our translation application. Here, we have our defs.ts file set up with the initial required configuration properties to make a translation API. We have this initial code in place because you have already seen it all before. The only point to make here is to notice the name of our audio file. Notice we have a new dragon story, which is in German. We will now translate this story into English and log the translated text to the console. Go ahead and compile and run your application. Next, let's go ahead and add in a prompt and our temperature configuration properties. These will help guide the AI in translating our dragon story and how creative to get. For the temperature, we'll set it to 0.6 to keep the translation as close to the original text as possible. For our prompt, as there are many dialects and nuances in the German language, depending on what region you're in, we will provide clarity in our prompt to help the AI understand that we want to avoid regional translations in our story. We'll set our prompt and temperature properties and again compile and run our translation application. There are many factors which may influence the translation, so you may or may not see different results from the first translation before adding in the prompt and temperature properties. And finally, let's add in the response format property. We'll set this to verbose JSON to see the full JSON output of the translation. Remember, this will only show the segments array as the Translation API does not support the timestamp granularities property, and therefore you cannot see the word level timestamps. Let's make the update to our main.ts file to log the JSON stringify data and compile and run our application. You'll need to use the verbose JSON output of the audio translation. Notice the output is virtually identical to the Transcription API output. In summary, we've seen that the Translation and Transcription APIs are very similar in their configuration and returned objects output properties. While they share properties such as model, file, prompt, temperature, and response format, the Translation API only will provide a segments array and does not use the language configuration property. That completes this lesson on configuring and executing the OpenAI Translation API. Stay tuned, and let's continue enhancing our AI-powered applications together.